It is Monday. I am Michael Cohen. Police departments across the country now having trouble recruiting. In fact, they're having trouble finding applicants that are not only well qualified, but are also racially diverse. Just how big of a problem is this for the country? Let's talk to Bobby Kimbrough Jr., law enforcement expert. Man has spent over 30 years in law enforcement, 22 as a senior special agent for the Department of Justice, and author of the book Surviving the Stop. Bobby, thank you for joining us once again on WILS.
Thank you for having me, sir. Pleasure's mine.
Tell me this, did you know you were going to be in law enforcement growing up?
You know, I did, because as I was sharing earlier, all my life, I grew up watching Jim West and Artemis Gordon and Wild Wild West. And for some reason, it was in my gut that I wanted to be that guy like Jim West. I wanted to be traveling around the country, helping people, fighting bad guys.
Now, where did you grow up?
I grew up in North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay, and what kind of neighborhood would you say that was?
Well, I grew up in East Winston, which was an all-black neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, was it a dangerous neighborhood, a good neighborhood? How would you describe it?
Well, no, growing up in the 60s, to me, it wasn't a dangerous neighborhood. No, it was a very nice, middle-class neighborhood in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, working-class people trying to raise their families.
And what do you, now, in terms of dealing with the police, what were the relations like back then?
Well, the relationships were a lot different, because you're talking about the 60s when I was coming up, 60s and 70s. So it was a totally different, totally different climate throughout the country, just not only in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was totally different. I mean,
when you say totally different, what do you mean?
In other words, in the 60s and the 70s, racism was a lot more prevalent than it is now. Now, when we see it, it isn't as prevalent as it was in the 60s and the 70s.
So do you remember your first interactions with police officers when you were young?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And what kinds of things what did you experience then initially with police?
Well, growing up in East Winston, you knew that the police, you didn't want any problems with them, and you showed them respect. The best way to survive was you stayed out of their way. You caused no problems, stayed out of their way, was respectable. But my parents raised me to be respectable to everybody. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have that problem anyway. But as it relates to the police, you knew, do not cause the police any problems. There were consequences if you caused the police problems.
Now, so if you look at what's happening today, what has changed? The way the police are doing their job, or the way the communities are reacting to them?
I think now, we're moving into this separation, which is dangerous, which worries me a lot, is that it's not a police problem, it's not an African-American, it's a we problem. Based on what we're experiencing, the remnants of a culture in which we have created. Mm-hmm. And now, because we have the television, we have superhighway, the World Wide Web, things that happen now become world news tonight.
Well, tell me this, Bobby. When you were growing up, did your parents ever say to you, look, these police officers, be careful? Did they say they were racist? Did you hear those kinds of comments?
No, growing up, what I heard from my parents was that as the police, you respect them. As the police, you do as they say, stay out of their way.
And what do you think young people are hearing today as compared to that?
Well, I can't say what young people, I know what I tell my kids, my boys who are driving, is that, you show respect, whether they're right or wrong, you still show them respect. Mm-hmm. If there's a problem, we'll deal with it in a courtroom. I think now, just not with African American, but I think our whole society is at a place of disrespect. You look at our politics, how we disrespect one another, how we disrespect the office of the White House, how we disrespect each other. Mm-hmm. And as long as we keep going down this road of disrespect, this, it brings us to a demise in law enforcement, in politics, in everyday living.
Talking to Bobby,
is running rampant.
We're talking to Bobby Kimbrough Jr. with over 30 years in law enforcement. His book, by the way, Surviving the Stop. In terms of diversity, how important is that to have black officers dealing with black communities? Why is that a big deal?
I think that it's not. I think that you need diversity in every form of our society, especially in law enforcement, because there's a lot of cultural differences in all of our cultures, and it would be helpful to your police department, advantageous, to have someone on there that's relatable to the culture in which you're trying to. And if not, you need to train the officers in that area as well as the community.
So do you believe black officers are better in dealing with inner city communities than white officers are?
I mean, to be honest about it, quite naturally, yeah. Because think about it. Most white officers only deal with African Americans in that community when they go in there to arrest, deal with the problem, respond to a 911 call or something. They have no interaction outside of that. Now,
what about their black fellow coworkers, their fellow police officers? How much interaction would you say there is between races on the force?
Well, truth of the matter, most of them grew up there, for the most part. If you were to go across the country and do a survey, you'd find that most African-American officers spend a lot of time in the communities, not maybe that particular community, but a community similar to that.
All right, so do you think that sometimes white officers have a different attitude in an urban community than black officers do?
Yeah, but think about it. We all, if you just stop for a minute and think about this, right? We all respond to things based on our experience, our exposure, and what we know, what the norm is. You and I and two other people can look at the same exact picture and take a totally different meaning from it. The same thing when you go into a call. I mean, I give the example all the time. You know, we went on a call several months ago where we had a search warrant, arrest warrant. We hit the house. When we hit the house, we got federal warrants. The guy was standing there with a rifle. The rifle was pointed at the ground. That was a justified shooting if we had chose to pull the trigger, but we didn't.
So is your feeling that a black officer would be less likely to shoot that person if that was, let's say, a black suspect?
No, what I'm saying is that a lot of times before the shooting ever takes place, before the problem, you see the manifestation of the problem before it ever happens. So what I'm saying is before it ever gets to a point where it's volatile, where trigger's about to be pulled, altercation, there is something right before that moment that communication, diversity, training, and cultural sensitivity can step in and say, whoa, let's back this up.
So how do you really train white officers who may have not been exposed to the urban environments? How do you train them to deal with it properly?
I think that is cultural training. I think we go into the communities. We have dialogue with the community leaders, with the people that work in those communities, the church leaders, the people that live in there. You know, everyone is in the urban area or crime-ridden areas, as they refer to them, that is not a criminal. It's like everybody in the hospital is not sick. I think about when I went to Detroit, Michigan, my first duty assignment from leaving Quantico, Detroit, Michigan was a culture shock to me. Going to the cash corridor, working off of the miles as an agent, that was a total culture shock.
You'd never seen anything like that, you're saying?
Never seen anything like that. That was a total culture shock.
Now, how did you initially react then when you were dealing in that environment?
Oh, when I first got to Detroit in the early 90s as a special agent and went into the cash corridor, I was like, oh, my goodness. I mean, it was a culture shock to me.
So when you were dealing with suspects, when you were dealing with suspects, did you find that you were uneasy then?
No, what I found was that I came from a totally different culture, and it took me a minute to learn the culture in which I was going to be working in. Because once I learned the culture, I knew how to move around in it. You know, there are certain mannerisms. If you were to go to a restaurant tonight and you watch, I just left the gym, and I do this all the time. If you watch two black guys walk in the gym and shake hands, they'll grip, they'll shake, they'll hug, and they'll hold for them and they'll release. You see two white guys come there, stand there, they'll shake, and they're going about even down to the simplest things of greeting one another. There's cultural difference.
Yeah, but really, when you see the violence that we're seeing, is it really that much just a cultural misunderstanding between officers and the people in the community? No,
what I see when I see the violence that I'm seeing in America, what I see is this. Not only is it a cultural difference, it's a mindset. Because guess what? Most of the time, people respond to what they see. Once they internalize it, then they respond, then they have an outburst. So if you've been exposed to something and it's totally new to you, whereas you and I could see the same outcome, and you'll respond different. The same situation I told you about hitting the house where the guy was standing with the rifle pointed at the ground, someone else probably would have shot him.
Okay. Is it fair to say that there's a racial problem with law enforcement?
Oh, I mean, anybody that say that would be lying to you. If it wasn't, that's why they have FLIOLA and you have NOBLE, National Association of Black Law Enforcement. If there wasn't a problem, there wouldn't be NOBLE, there wouldn't be FLIOLA, there wouldn't be. There's so many different.
So what are you saying? Have you ever heard a fellow white officer say something racist while you're around?
I mean, what you learn from law enforcement is this, and this is one that I'd like to give this to your listeners. Anybody, the best advice that you could ever give someone gave it to me, my field training officer. And he said this: when you pin this badge on, and you hit the streets 1041 checking on, you don't represent white, you don't represent black. You represent what is right, what is fair, and what is just. And that's the principle that I lived by. So quite naturally, just by the conversation that you hear in the locker rooms, the conversation that you hear, sometimes they forget who you are, and they don't see you as color. They see you as just another officer.
So they would make racial comments, you're saying, in your presence, and is that what you're saying?
That's a natural occurrence, whether they're joking or playing. But the thing is that we all have our own biases, but that don't make us bad. The problem comes when we use that and it influences how we treat people, mistreat them, and how we make our decisions. We all have differences. That's what makes America great. But we've got to have a real conversation, whether it's in hiring police officers, whether it's the community.
So tell me this: if you're dealing with a mostly black community, do you think the officers should also be mostly black?
No, I don't think that we get into the place to where you got to have mostly black officers dealing in a black community. No, what I'm saying is that if you put people in those communities, we've got to have sensitivity training. Because
how do you do that, though? Like, I mean, I'm just wondering, if you have a lifetime of growing up, how do you make someone sensitive in a matter of a few weeks or months?
You don't make them in a matter of a few weeks or you make them throughout the whole 9 months, 6 months training that it takes for an officer to become a sworn officer. But here's one thing that you got to remember. No police department across the country, check the stats on this one for me, does a periodic psychological check or background check. Only the federal government does this that I know of. Every 5 years, the federal government comes in and do another. You
think that should be done regularly, you're saying?
Without question, because guess what? The officer that you hired in 2010 is not the same officer in 2016. I promise you that. Because what happens is you have to develop certain skills to do the job. My first homicide, my first fatality shook me to my core. But guess what? The third, the fourth, and the fifth one, it didn't, because I had to put up a shield. I had developed defense mechanisms to deal with that. But along the way, officers become hard and they become disconnected. And this is one of the reasons that one of the trainings that we're doing now is surviving the shield. The guy that you hired in 2010 is not the officer in 2016. And when you find this out, we need to have training, we need to have psychologicals, and we need to have conversation.
Yeah, well, certainly some therapy would probably help too. Bobby Kimbrough Jr., man who spent over 30 years in law enforcement, author of the book Surviving the Stop. Bobby, as always, it's been very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.